So today I have Preston Taylor joining us, and Preston is an amazing wildlife trailer. He lives out in California, Northern California, just near the Oregon border. He's a specialist in trailing black bears, and he's also author of the book Tracking the American Black Bear. He's a cyber tracker evaluator, and really great to have him join us today, and appreciate your time, Preston. Welcome.
Thanks. It's great to be here, Lee.
Well, hey, Preston, just getting started, you have a really interesting history. And if you don't mind just kind of covering that, where you grew up, how you got into the outdoors, obviously trailing specifically, and particularly your interest in black bears, how that all came about.
Yeah. I grew up in Boston, Massachusetts, right in the middle of the city. I really was a city rat for the first part of my life in childhood and teenage years. But my dad grew up in the mountains in North Carolina, and he was a scientist and was interested in the natural world. And so he, engaged me in activities here and there with nature that, laid a foundation, I think, for me to follow later in life. He really enjoyed digging clams, and we're here to talk about tracking. And at its most basic level, tracking is just making observations of disturbances against the background. And so these little things that my dad did with me, digging clams or trying to catch crabs or observing the planets, stuff like that, I think played a role later in my pursuit of learning about nature. But it wasn't really until when I was 16 that I went to a wilderness program out in Utah, and we lived in the desert and mountains for a couple months, that I really got involved in the natural world. Making fire, with sticks. There was no lighters or matches, sleeping under the stars, or if it did rain, under a tarp, just out there in the elements for a long period of time. And that's where I started.
Boss, by the way?
No, it wasn't. It's called Wilderness Quest.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, I think I've heard of those guys.
Yeah. It was pretty cool. Definitely changed my life. And then I went to high school in Idaho after that. And we spent a lot of time in the mountains too. And so after high school, I moved back to the East Coast, and I was there for a few months trying to figure out what to do, and eventually moved up to Vermont and started being a part of that community up there, the Vermont Wilderness School, and really diving into tracking and to primitive skills and naturalist knowledge, natural history, all those kinds of things. And that's where I started focusing on learning about animals, learning about tracking, and really I spent, so that was, when I was 19, and then I spent a good 4 or 5 years really just working there and focused on learning about animals, and decided to go back to school to get a degree in wildlife management. And so while I was going to school, I also started pursuing the cyber tracker certification process. And so kind of in conjunction of studying academic wildlife conservation, I was also trying to attain the senior tracker certificate within the cyber tracker system. And so pretty much just focused on school and tracking for 10 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. That's really interesting, actually, because that's sort of full circle. I teach tracking courses at a couple, 2 or 3 universities, and I'm really always pushing cyber tracker eval, because it's such a great learning experience. And so you kind of did that on your own way back in the day. You're studying it, and then at the same time, you're trying to get certified.
Yeah, it was fun. So it was a good process. I learned a lot about wildlife, and also a lot about myself, when you're going for those last couple of points and battling yourself in your head and self-confidence and everything like that. It's amazing what it brings up in you.
Wow. Yeah, that is great. And then so from there, you were still out east. How'd you end up in California?
No, so when I started school, I moved out west. and I was
Okay.
going to community college. I went to community college for 4 years. I'd take a couple classes, and then if I could get a seasonal wildlife technician job somewhere in the country, I would take that and take a semester off. And so I was kind of bouncing around from seasonal wildlife jobs back to school. So it took me about 4 years to get enough credits to transfer. And then I transferred up here to where I live now, up in Humboldt County to Humboldt State University.
Okay.
It's now a Cal Polytech, but transferred here, finished my degree here, and I've stayed here, since I graduated. Yeah.
Wow, that's incredible. And is that where you got into, black bears, or how did that transpire?
Yeah.
Was that a gradual?
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't like an intention of mine to like really focus on bears, but where I live now is one of the highest densities of black bears on the continent. We have a ton of bears. It's really cool. And so just being thrown into this world with all these bears, it's hard to, operate in the natural world without interacting with them. And so I did sort of really start focusing on them and spending a lot of time around them and tracking them and learning about them. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really cool. And then the hunting part came later. I know, because you're a bow hunter, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah. When I moved out west, I started hunting too. So kind of like, I think I was 24 when I started going back to college. And so right kind of around the same times I started going to college, I started doing the cyber tracker certifications, and I started hunting. Yeah.
Okay. And this took, this happened over a period of years, right? So it's just this constant learning process.
Yeah, definitely. School took me especially because I was bouncing back and forth between seasonal jobs, it was like 8 years or 9 years or something to get my bachelor's. And then the cyber tracker process, when I first started that, I'd already been tracking for 4 or 5 years, but to get a senior certificate took me 9 years of doing the evaluations.
Wow.
Yeah. And then, through all that whole time too, learning about hunting and, that whole process. Yeah.
Yeah. And we may talk more about cyber tracker later, but for people listening, the senior, correct me if I'm wrong here, but you have to excel and get the highest certification, both tracking and trailing, right?
Yeah, so it's 100% on a track and sign specialist evaluation and 100% on the trailing specialist evaluation. Yep.
Yeah, and I can attest that is exceedingly difficult. Yeah, which is so. Some people might be listening, thinking, "Wow, 9 years and all that." It's like, yeah, that's some people do it in less, but I've heard stories people have done it longer, right? So
yeah,
yeah, it's
it's everybody, it's a different journey for everyone. So some people some people get there quicker than others, but it's all a journey, and it's not like you arrive anywhere at the end. There's still so much to learn.
I mentioned, I think I told you this before offline, but I mentioned to Steve Ranello when I was on his podcast a few months ago. I was like, there's this guy that you should go out with in California, trailing bears. And he's not really, well, I don't know. I don't want to say he's not a bow guy, but he's a gun guy, I think. But nonetheless, I was like, you need to go with this. So anyway, I'm going to mention that to him again if I chat with him again. But
okay, thanks. Yeah, I think he said one time that he's a good tracker, or he said he's really good at identifying sign because he likes to trap beavers.
Yeah. Yeah, I was interesting. I found out more about him. I kind of was wondering about that, but then his dad was I don't know if his dad was a trapper, but he did a lot of trapping as a kid. And I mean, even like small rodents and muskrats, and I think he really does know it. So he'd probably find it really interesting. But yeah,
there was go ahead, Lee.
No, that was it.
Oh, there was a really interesting study done by this guy Keller, and he interviewed a bunch of different groups of people, and he had a whole series of questions about animal natural history. And the groups that scored the highest in animal natural history and behavior knowledge were birders and trappers. And the groups that scored the lowest were trophy hunters
Yep.
and anti-hunters. So it's kind of a funny dichotomy.
That is, but
Yeah.
it's, as you know, it's probably not surprising, right? Because if you're a trapper, you got to look for all this sign. You got to know habitat, right? You have to know where to find animals, and birders are constant. I mean, I teach bird language. You're constantly. I mean, before I did it, it's like now that I look back, I wasn't paying attention to anything. So
Yeah, and I think both of those groups of people they're just always in the woods, and very observant, which is really what it's all about.
Yeah, I was just, when you were talking about density of bears, I ran another program just south of the border here. It's been a few years ago now, but and I guess supposedly it has the highest, or one of the very highest densities of black bears just across in Mexico in the Burro Mountains. So would love to get you down there. It's tough substrate, but obviously bears, you can, as you well know, you can trail or track in other ways besides just leaving footprints.
Well, and in those desert environments, like in the Southwest, it can be really good when the substrate's dusty. If it's been dry for a while, it can be really good trailing with those kind of animals. It's crazy. Like bears used to be. You're in Texas, and that whole hill country used to be covered in bears.
Yeah.
There used to be a lot of bears, throughout parts of this country where they're not anymore. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good point. I've read those accounts, and I grew up there, and even occasionally we get a few stragglers up there. Guys like Joan Evans, whom chronicle that. So that brings up a couple of questions, though, is in your own words, and again, for people that might be new to this or not that familiar, how would you distinguish or differentiate between tracking versus trailing?
I mean, there isn't really a difference, but we sort of created a difference, bringing the cyber tracker system over here to America, because it comes from South Africa. And really before that showed up here, the tracking community in the States was really focused on identifying tracks, and looking at them and interpreting sign and things like that. There were people that were trailing and locating animals by actually following the tracks, and search and rescue people, border patrol that were locating people from following tracks and things like that. But most of the wildlife trackers, just considered going out and looking at a tracking. So we kind of have pushed this word trailing just to differentiate the act of trying to locate an animal through the interpretation of their signs, following it, right? And there's not really a difference, but there is a difference in maybe the intention of someone who says they're going trailing specifically. It is to find fresh sign and follow that to the animal, at the end of the trail.
Yeah, I find that fascinating. Obviously, they go hand in hand. And, for instance, my students, the course is predominantly about, in the terms you defined it, tracking, identifying. And from a scientific perspective, obviously, that has a lot of uses. But I personally am really attracted to trailing. And what is it? The Greatest Dance? Is that right? Is that the documentary? Yeah. Just our human ancestry, and was it Liebenberg says, that it's like the oldest science, or maybe an art and a science, but it's just amazing. These guys following for 8 hours, and I've heard story. I know you've been on trails for hours, right? And I've heard, Casey McFarland talk about that, and some others. And yeah, it must be an incredible experience.
It is, and you kind of fall into the zone. But what's neat about trailing is, trailing really puts the identification and interpretation of tracks into play, and into like a rhythm and a movement. So if you're following a bear through the woods and you're looking out into the forest ahead of you, you see bark removed from a tree. How quickly and how far away can you interpret that as being either a bear cambium feeding, or porcupine cambium feeding, or an elk or deer antler rub, or just another tree that fell and scrape the bark off, right? Because if you can distinguish fresh bear cambium feeding way out in the distance from all those other potential signs, that can keep you on the trail faster and more efficiently, right? And so when you're trailing, you are identifying and interpreting tracks and sign, but you're just doing it rapidly, sometimes a little bit unconsciously, and you're not really like diving down into the details that we often do when people look at tracks and sign, in a mud puddle or in a sandy road. It's very quick, interpretations. And if you need to take a close look, you can, but it's really neat because it just puts that into play, right? It's like a mobile tracking. Yeah.
That's really cool. Again, one of the chapters I teach, I just covered one chapter on trailing, but some of those principles. And one of the things I try to get across, and that was a great example of, it can be such a time saver, and if you're on either you're hunting or, job function, you're trying to find a wounded animal, a poacher, whatever the case is. Before I started learning this, it's like I didn't realize how many strategies or tactics there were and how valuable they are, and how much save you time or making a mistake or whatever. And then the other thought that comes, from today's world, it just uses a different part of our brain. Obviously, tracking does too. They both do. And, like pattern matching, which is all like this artificial intelligence, so sometimes I'm talking to people, I say, well, we actually are artificial intelligence, or we have that built in, right? I mean, this innate pattern tracking, you can learn this, right? And it's something that maybe a lot of it, well, we do use constantly, like we evaluate city landscapes, right? We're walking around or a dangerous situation, we've seen something else is dangerous. But in terms of nature, we don't do that much anymore, but it was absolutely essential to our survival at one point in time, right?
Yeah.
So just based on that, can you maybe state some other things? You're a biologist, right? You're a trained biologist. Why is trailing an important skill? And it's also, I think fun, or you certainly seem to enjoy it, but, what are some, I guess, practical aspects of it?
So I guess that there's two ways to think about it. Tracking and trailing with snow, and then tracking and trailing without snow. And when there's snow cover, you can follow almost any sized animal that moves around across the top of the snow. I mean, back when I lived in New England, I remember Josh Roberts and I followed this southern flying squirrel across the landscape, or was it northern? It might have been a northern flying squirrel. I can't remember at this point. But when we were able to follow this flying squirrel from tree to tree, and because the snow was on the branches, we could see which branches that the squirrel was using, and we followed the squirrel to different conchs that it was feeding on, and things like that. And so when there's snow, as a biologist, when there's snow, you can obviously get a lot of information about smaller animals, martins and fishers and bobcats and things that might be very challenging, if not impossible, to trail without snow, right? And then without snow, depending on the conditions of the substrate, obviously we can follow a lot of the big animals, and then it just depends on the conditions of the substrate down to how small it is. But being able to follow any of these animals as they go about their lives through the woods, it gives you an insight into the behavior and interaction of this animal with its environment and with other animals that it's difficult to develop that relationship and understanding of the animal any other way. I mean, aside from, when you get to watch an animal, it's pretty cool. And if you're in an environment that allows you to watch animals for long periods of time, then you can get a lot of this information too. Like Olaus Murie, on one of his studies that he published, was the diet of elk. And I can't remember where this was. I think it was outside of Yellowstone, but he would spend all day observing an elk herd feeding, and then he would go over there and crawl around and try to find the plants they nibbled on, and you can do that by watching animals in open environments. But if the forest is too thick to see the animal, or if they're too skittish to let you watch them for very long, you're not going to be able to get these kind of observations. And so there's really no other way to learn about an animal so intimately than by following it and literally walking in its footsteps, right? You walk step by step where this animal is going through the forest. You can see the plants they've nibbled off, or you can see where they've chased a deer, you know, if you're following a mountain lion, or snuck up on a bedded bighorn sheep. You get to see where the animal lays down and rests, and how that changes with the weather patterns, or if it's feeling pressure by other predators or humans. You get to see their scent marking behavior. You get to smell the animal. So there's this, it develops this intimate relationship with the natural world that's very difficult to get any other way. And so as a biologist, having that foundation allows me to confront a question, a hypothesis, or a problem, or a management goal, with this, kind of alternative, relationship with these animals, right? So like I work as an ungulate biologist for the Yurok tribe right now. And so we do elk and deer conservation work. And I've spent a lot of time with these elk and deer in these hills, following them around. And so it just gives me, a broader knowledge of how they behave, and thinking about conservation of them, and, just helps in that way, helps guide that. For biologists too, and managers, there's other ways that you can use trailing to collect, DNA from fur or from scat. You can record habitat use, you can record behavior, interactions with predators and prey and things like that. So there's a lot of behavioral information you can get, as well as there's a lot of studies that are using game cameras now. And so you can use trailing to help guide where to place those cameras. What's the most likely place to capture the species and the behavior that you're going for, so tracking really plays a role with that and can help guide that. Because I know of, camera studies that people just put out randomly, you know what I mean? And you're missing a lot out there doing it like that.
Yeah, I guess you can fill in the missing pieces, right? So many gaps that trail camera's not going to get. I'm also reminded too, as you speak, that in addition, just pure biology or science, and again, I have some students who are, game wardens, or let's say veterinarian forensics. And I've got one guy wrote me in the last semester saying that, once he started learning this, and studying the course, and then on his own, he actually pursued a guy. It was in your neck of the woods, Connecticut, over a mile through the forest, and caught the guy and charged him with the wildlife crime and killed a bobcat illegally.
Oh, wow. Yeah. The possibilities are just, really up to your imagination. But it's, yeah, tracking has been used by Border Patrol and game wardens for, before we had a lot of the technology. The old school field biologists, they had to be good trackers, yeah.
So if you, again, somebody comes to you, just out of the blue and says, hey, Preston, I want to learn about trailing. How do you go about it? Or how would you advise them? And let's say, they didn't have, access, it couldn't take a cyber tracker, evaluation or something like that. What would you tell them?
Yeah. So first off, you need a place to go. So you need either a patch of public land, city, county, park, or national forest, BLM, or a ranch that a friend lets you on, where it's legal for you to go off trail, right? And you need some kind of large animal there, like at least a deer-sized animal. Deer, feral hogs, elk, moose, things like that are good animals to start with. Large ungulates, hoofed animals. Even cattle, horses, they're good animals to start with. And what I tell people to do is just walk around this place until you see an animal. You see a deer, or you see a hog, right? And if they run away, great. If they don't run away, watch them till they walk out of view, and then go over to the spot they were standing, find their tracks, and try to follow them. I think that's a great way to start, because you need to be on fresh tracks. The fresher the trail is, the easier it's going to be to actually catch up to that animal. And at first it can be difficult to age, what's fresh and what's old and what's too old to follow. And so if you start with, tracks that you just saw an animal standing in, it's a great place to begin, and the animal's not too far away. So that's a good way to start. And then once you've had a little practice, maybe at aging tracks or following them like that, you can just walk around until you cut tracks that you think are fresh and try to follow them. And a couple of considerations to keep in mind are what's the quality of the substrate, because you're not going to be able to start on a set of tracks and catch up to an animal in any substrate across any condition of the ground. Just the easy example would be when the ground freezes, right? If it's frozen solid like a rock, I mean, I've seen a herd of elk run across the ground like that, and you're hard pressed to find any sign, right? So consider what's the substrate, and start looking at conditions for when it's easier and when it's harder. Maybe when it's really dry and dusty, it's easier. Maybe when it rains and the leaves are really moist, it's easier. Maybe if the leaves are dropping in the fall and covering the tracks, it's really hard, So just things to consider are how difficult is the substrate, to follow the trail, and then just practice. But really, you want to be on the freshest tracks you can, because those will be the easiest to see and the closest to the animal. And you just need to persevere and recognize that, like every skill, you're not going to be very good at it when you start, right? Like playing an instrument, nobody can pick up the guitar and just rip on it. You know what I mean? You have to put your time in, put your dues in, learn the scales and practice your chords, and build up this skill set that you can put into play later. And so it's the same thing with tracking. It's start when it's easy, work on just following some tracks, work on seeing difficult tracks, work on finding the trail after you lose it. And, within, a few months, certainly a couple years, if you do this regularly, you'll start to have some success, maybe catch up to animals every now and again and build from there. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's evident by what you said that, again, depending on where you live, time of year can play into this as well, right? And if I remember correctly, where you are and when you're out tracking trailing bears, springtime is really good time.
Yeah. The substrate, it plays a huge role in your ability to find an animal. The other thing that plays a very big role is a person's intimate knowledge of the landscape and the behavior of those animals. So when you're learning, and just across the board, obviously, there are substrates that are going to be easier to follow tracks in and substrates that are going to be too difficult to follow tracks in. But when someone knows an area really well, they can make larger jumps across difficult substrate and bigger leaps of like intuition of where they think the animal's going to get back on the trail, just because they know that area so well. But definitely to start, and in general, the substrate, is going to dictate whether or not you can find an animal or not, so where I am here, yeah, springtime, following bears, it's excellent. It can be so good that you can catch up to bears, you start on a trail and you can find them and sneak up on them. It's pretty cool. In the middle of the summer, it can be very, very difficult and to an extent impossible, to start on a fresh track and find that animal. Yeah.
And I guess that's where also knowing the animal or the species and being familiar with their behavior and habitats they prefer and time of year, what they're feeding on, which obviously you're going to learn that if you trail anyway. But if you know some of that ahead of time, I would think that's very helpful.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely. Just basic, natural history information. What do they eat? When is that, food available throughout the year? What are their, what's driving them at this time of the year? When's their mating season? That kind of stuff. Yeah, just general biology information for sure. It's very important. Yeah.
What about if you happen to live in an area, let's say that's doesn't have any of those big animals, or short on time, whatever the reason is, substrates maybe tough. have you tried, or do you recommend people cutting their own trail? And if so, you maybe describe that process and how that works.
Yeah, that's great practice. When we're trailing, really what we're doing is we're looking for disturbances in the distance against the background of the forest, right? And the quicker you can recognize those disturbances, the faster that you, or the more efficient you can move on the trail. I shouldn't say faster. And so just for practice, if you have 10 minutes, or if you're in a location that's a little far from, big animals to practice on, it's a great idea to walk through the woods, lay down a trail. You could do a big loop and come back to where you started, and then try to stay on your trail and just practice seeing that sign in the distance, right? How far ahead can you see it? Step through different substrates so it changes. You can make it easy to start, and then you can make it more difficult as you're progressing. But for sure, and what I do too is, like, even when the substrate gets really challenging, if I'm driving around for work and I'm driving in the mountains back here and I jump a bear or I jump a deer, I'll get out of my truck and I'll go look at where that animal went into the woods, and I might try to follow it. And sometimes this substrate is so challenging that I can only positively stay on the trail for 50 yards or maybe 300 yards until it peters out and I can't be sure of where the animal went. But I still practice that because, it's good to just keep your eye sharp, to see what it looks like, to see a really fresh trail, even if it's difficult conditions. Maybe you can only see 10 tracks in 100 yards, but you got 100 yards in really hard conditions, and it's all practice. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. I've done some of that. And, like you said, if you're cutting your own trail, you can really mark it, dig your foot in, as you're going. Makes it easy at first. But then you also learn all kinds of things, like about aging, what it looks like next day, what it looks like, or how quickly the, grass pops back up, and
Yep.
it depends on all kinds of things,
Yep.
time of year, weather, et cetera.
Yeah.
But
yeah. And something else I do too is when I'm just walking in the woods, I like to walk behind people, because then I look at the tracks that they make, and I look at the tracks actually bounce back or disappear, or, even if it's difficult conditions, if I'm just working with someone, like with my techs or something, and they're walking in front of me, I'm always just kind of watching to see, oh man, it's really tough to see their tracks, even though they're right in front of me,
yeah, yeah, that's fantastic. And I haven't done this yet with my kids, but I want to do that log trick where, you tie a piece of rope, maybe have some nails or something pounded into a log, and drag it, and then just, see if they can follow it, what have you.
Yeah. 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 And that, and we talk a lot about wildlife, but I mean, this skill set is also super valuable for search and rescue, so definitely practicing on humans. I mean, it's great, great practice for sure.
Can you discuss, especially if someone gets, better at this and over time starts to become proficient, like you're saying, probably takes years to really, get good, but there's also some ethics involved, I guess, in trailing, for lack of a better term, or some, do's and don'ts. And can you talk about that? And, as regards to, trying to find animals, getting close to them, disturbing them, not disturbing them, and also just some do's and don'ts, because one of the goals is obviously, you want to get close to wildlife. And so I know in the cyber tracker eval, there's some things that, if you do this or that, boy, they bust you, right?
Yeah.
So maybe you just speak to a few of those.
Yeah. I think, first off, I think it's important to consider that we are doing this, probably for fun, probably for maybe professional development. But very few of us are going to live and die from our tracking, skills. Especially those of us that are probably listening to this on a computer. We're not living a true hunter-gatherer lifestyle, right? So it's not a life and death situation. So it is important to consider what's our impact, on the animal. And there's really obvious times of the year that you probably wouldn't want to push an animal, like where it gets really cold and really deep snow and the deer yard up, like those whitetail winter yards. You want to consider, if you walk into there, what are you going to do to those animals? Are you going to make them run around? expend a lot of energy. Are you creating a trail that coyotes can then follow into there? You know what I mean? Maybe it's the opposite. Maybe it's during the hot, dry season, and you're trailing animals and jumping them out of their shady, cool beds in the middle of the day when it's really hot and there's no water except for 2,000 feet below you, and they don't want to go back down there to get water. So definitely want to consider what are the stresses to the animals at this time of year, and what's your impact going to be? Because our goal is to catch up to them, and our really the ultimate goal is to sneak up on the animal, right, without it observing us, which is very difficult to do, especially when you're dealing with animals that probably get hunted. You know what I mean? Most of the national forests, a lot of these big game animals are getting hunted. They're not comfortable around people. If you were in Yellowstone or something like that, then they might be more comfortable, more tolerant, right?
And there's your own safety factor, right? Especially with the
Yeah,
bigger animal. Yeah.
yeah, and there's definitely a safety factor. There are very obvious situations that you have to consider for safety, like walking up on a grizzly bear that's defending a carcass, or any bear with cubs. But there's also less obvious, situations. Elk, moose, when they have calves, will definitely defend them. Even deer to an extent. That I got bluffed and charged by a doe with fawns. And so yeah, you want to consider safety, and then for us in North America too, safety involves ticks and tick-borne diseases, plants that'll give you rashes, poison oak, poison ivy, things like that. Getting lost and just operating when you're following an animal's trail. You're not in places that people usually go, and you're going to be zigzagging and swirling around and going down into dark tunnels and crawling around through the bushes, and all of a sudden you stand up and you're like, where is the truck? Right?
Yeah.
Or it's sunset and I've been following this animal for 5 hours and 4 miles. So now what am I going to do, right? So just being prepared for that, keep an awareness of your surroundings, maybe a headlamp, having some clothes, things like that.
I mean, this is one of the things, this is why to me, trailing is, I don't say my favorite, and I don't get to do near as much of it, and subterranean is tough, but I just love it because it's all encompassing. I mean, it includes so many things from other skill sets, and or bird language, your bird alarm, or you like said, keeping track, navigating, right? And, being aware of your surroundings, the wind, right? Knowing the direction, obviously, if you're hunting, that's super important. It's just so many facets to it. And I remember I did a workshop with you last year, which is great. And I've done a lot of backpacking before, and it's great. But when you go off, you follow an animal's trail, gosh, you see so much more in terms of other animal sign and wildlife and, nests, beds, whatever the case is, that it just, and again, you can kind of lose yourself in it, right? And depending on where you are, that can cause some problems, or time of year or weather, but it's just amazing at all the things that again, I don't want to say one skill, it's one I would choose, but I mean, I can't think of one where you actually learn more if you
when you commit to following an animal's trail. And a lot of times I find tracks by walking a hiking trail, or I'm walking an old road, or, and so as I'm walking along, I'm kind of in this human mindset, 2 feet walking upright. But when that animal leaves that human road or that human hiking trail and goes into the, the forest or into the desert, you literally and figuratively leave the anthropocentric world and enter into that javelina or that wild hog or that bear's world, physically and mentally, because to move quietly through the woods, a lot of times you're crawling. These animals are low to the ground, and so you have to get under bushes, and to move efficiently, you have to move on their trail as well. And so you start to navigate the environment in a way that's not human. It is the way that the javelina sees the desert, or it is the way that the bear sees, the bush. And when you start to follow that trail long enough and well enough that you don't have to think about the process,
you're just kind of do it. And you're not thinking, and when you spend hours not thinking, crawling down a bear's tunnel and looking at what it's eating and smelling at what it's smelling and laying down in the animal's bed, you shed this human, mindset that we're in all the time. And it's a really unique perspective and cool to just get into that different mindset. And then what we do on, the cyber tracker evaluations is we're rating, people's ability to follow trails. But one of the things that we look at is as the trail becomes more difficult to follow, is the person still able to be aware of their surroundings? Do they still know where we are in relationship to where we started? Are they still paying attention to the bird songs and the bird alarm calls? Are they still aware of the wind direction? Because this is what we see happen is as the trail becomes more difficult, these other awareness levels shrink, right? Until it becomes so challenging just to follow the tracks that someone
you get tunnel vision, right?
The tunnel vision, and they have no idea where they are in the woods anymore, I remember on one of my specialist evaluations, we had been crawling in circles through Salmonberry on these bear trails. And at the end of the day, Nate, and Brian and Mark said, okay, we're done. And Nate looked at me and he goes, how do we go home? Just to see if I knew which way to even go, And
let me get my GPS out. Yeah. Well, and other stuff too. Like I had an experience with my wife. She's a biologist. We were on actually our honeymoon in Italy. And in this, I know most people wouldn't think of this, but there's a couple national parks there that have bears, brown bears, and wolves. And so, we came up and I guess, correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the cyber tracker metrics is you come up to a ridge, and you don't want to just pop up over, right? Or you come to a clearing, you're in the forest, you got to stop and pause, right? And take stock, excuse me. And she kind of wanted to plow through there or something. And I think she ended up staying behind, but I stopped. It really worked. And then I waited and paused, made sure the wind was right, popped over, and sure enough, there are two wolves there, and it was awesome. And then they kind of, do this thing, what's, where'd you come from? And then they took off, as you would expect. But it's just amazing when you follow those rules, you see so much more. And, if, like you said, if you don't get in that tunnel vision, which can lead to other issues as you described.
Wow, that's cool. There's probably not too many wolves there.
No, there's not. I saw another one in Romania on another trip, which was really just a glimpse, it's really, really fast, but it's amazing. This stuff really works. It does. And I've just blown away, and, doing that workshop with you last year, and, I'm doing with Casey before, and it's incredible. It really is an amazing skill. And actually, if you don't mind, and I know you have a lot of them, but do you mind sharing just maybe one or two kind of your favorite sort of, trailing stories and,
Yeah. I'll tell you one from this summer in June. I was in North Idaho with Sandy Reed and Christy Fries. We're doing some trailing. And
where were you exactly?
North Idaho. That's as specific as I want to get.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
Yeah. And actually Marcus Rainerson was there, but left before this happened. And Melissa Weeks showed up a couple days after. But anyway, we were practicing trailing, that's what we were there for. And we were cruising up a road in the truck, just looking for fresh tracks. And Sandy, looking out the window, said, oh, hey, there's a pretty fresh doe and fawn trail here. And I said, oh, well, let's look at it. We wanted to really focus on bears and bigger animals, I think elk and moose, but this was really fresh. And so we decided to look at it. The road we were driving in was a dirt road. Paralleling the road was a recent logging operation, right? So for about 300 yards, it was pretty clear. And then there was forest behind that, and then a mountain going up behind there. And the deer tracks were going into that logged area. They were very fresh. And I asked Sandy if she wanted to follow them, and she said that she did. So we parked the truck, grabbed our stuff for the day, because you never know what's going to happen when you're trailing. Take all your stuff, and started going. And Sandy was doing really well at following these deer tracks. Deer can go from being super easy to follow and in a couple steps be almost impossible, when you're moving well on a trail, it creates efficiency and it allows you to move quietly, right? When you're struggling on a trail, oftentimes you just make more noise. So when someone's moving well on the trail, it's just quieter and smoother, and there's less disturbance, to the environment. And so because Sandy was following this trail really well, we moved across this patch of clear cut quickly and quietly. And as we came into the edge of the woods, the hill kind of dipped down and there was a big pond, and she wasn't sure. There was 2 game paths going around the pond and she wasn't sure which way the deer went. So she just took the left one. And as we got down into this cedar flat, she found some deer tracks, right? So we knew we were on the right one. And when someone is following the trail well, I don't have to pay attention to the tracks as much. I can be paying attention to the broader picture, and I can be looking for animals, or I can be looking for the animal sign way up in the distance. And so because Sandy was following the trail so well, I was looking out ahead. And as we came down into this cedar flat across the pond, I caught movement. Actually, what I first saw was the texture of an animal's fur, which is the texture of an animal's fur often is different than the surrounding environment. And that's one of the things I key into when I'm looking for animals. So I saw this soft texture, and then I saw a little bit of movement. And I could see kind of the general color was brown, and we were in grizzly country. And so I didn't know if I was looking at a grizzly bear, a brown colored black bear, a moose, or maybe even an elk, but it didn't look right, quite the right color for an elk. So I gave Sandy and Christy, we have a bunch of different signals for when we see an animal, if we see a potentially dangerous animal. So I gave them the little signal, right? That there's maybe a dangerous animal near us, and everybody froze. And I kind of signaled, to look that way, right? And they looked and they could see the animal, and we could hear kind of tearing noises and this weird crunching noise. And then we saw the animal's head come up, right? And a big chunk of something with it. But when the animal's head come up, we could see that it was a bear, and we could see the dished out, nose of a grizzly, right? And so we knew it was a bear, we knew it was a grizzly. The animal was probably 50 yards away from us, and we figured out very quickly that the bear was feeding on a carcass and tearing at the skin and the muscle and crunching bones.
You don't want to be too close to that.
Yeah. And then we also figured out that behind that bear was a bigger bear in the brush, just walking around back and forth and vocalizing to this bear. And so this is June, which is the peak of black bear and grizzly bear's mating season. So we had a sow feeding on the carcass of an animal, and then a boar behind her in the bushes, just, courting her, right? Because bears take a lot of courtship to mate. And so he's just vocalizing to her and stuff. So the whole time, the wind was in our favor. It's blowing from the bears towards us, but we bunched up really close together, and we all had our bear spray out, and we're just watching them. And I was kind of, in that situation, you have a couple of options. You could sneak away because the bears didn't know we were there, or you could stay to watch them and see what happens. And we wanted to kind of let it play out. So we watched them, and we got to watch this bear feed on this carcass for about 20 minutes, a good long time. And until I felt the hairs on the back of my neck kind of stand up when the wind shifted. And the wind shifted right at the back of us and drifted slowly over to that bear. Her head came up the instant like the wind got over to her. Her head came up, and you could see her smelling, and she just turned and bolted into the woods away from us. When her head came up and she smelled this, that was like the moment where I didn't know what was going to happen, right? Yeah. Is she going to come towards us or go away? She just turned and bolted. The big bear, I don't know if he knew what was going on either, but he followed her too. And so they went back in the woods, and I know our hearts were pounding, but we were like, okay, cool. Let's back out of here.
That was pretty sweet. We got back to the trucks. We drove up, a few miles to be totally away from the area. And then we like got out and kind of decompressed and talked about how cool that was. We were following a freshly born deer fawn, a doe and her newborn fawn. I mean, the fawn's tracks were tiny. And we hypothesized that maybe the bears had killed that fawn because like that was right where the trail was going. So and if it was a fawn, a deer fawn, it wouldn't take a bear very long to eat.
Yeah.
So we decided to give those bears the whole day, and 9 hours later, walk back in there to see what they were eating. Right. So this time we parked the truck, and the whole way across the clear cut, we're making noise. Hey bear, stepping on sticks and cracking loud stuff and stopping and talking. And we got to the top of the hill, where it goes down to the pond, and we stood there for 5 minutes just talking and making noise. And we're like, okay, they're probably not here, right? So we dropped down onto the right side of the pond this time. And as we're approaching the thicket where the bears were, now we're a little closer. We're about 40 yards away from it. The sow jumps up, makes a bunch of woofs, and then runs away from us. And the boar jumps up too, and he runs a little ways, but then he turns around and he starts woofing. And so we're all like, whoa, hey, hey, we're people. And we just start backing out, right? And the whole time bear spray in front of us, just backing out, walked, 400 yards backwards to the car, got in, and we were like, geez, we didn't think they would stay there the whole time. We walked in yelling. So we left. And the next day we got up and we were trying to decide if we should give them more time or if we should just go in there to see what they were doing. And we decided to pull up and see what it felt like. And so we pulled up into the truck and we got out, and I can't remember what it sounded like before when the bears were there. But the next morning when we pulled up, there were birds singing, and we saw a turkey in the clear cut, like near where the bears had been. And it just felt different, right? And we're like, okay, I think we can go in there, this time. So this time we did the same thing. We're just making a ton of noise, walking in. We get down to the thicket. We're making lots of noise, and nothing happens. And we walk up on the scene, and the bear had been feeding on an elk calf that they caught, probably right before we got there the day before. So us following the doe and fawn and the bears killing the elk calf were just total coincidence, and we happened to all be at the same place at the same time. Yeah. And these two bears, it was so cool. I mean, they dug a huge crater in the earth to bury, the carcass while they were feeding on the calf. And there was a couple of beds nearby and a couple of piles of droppings. All that was left from the calf was part of one jaw, the 4 lower legs, part of the hip, and I think that's it. Everything else was eaten. Hide, the entire spinal column, the skull, the stomach contents, everything else was eaten. It was incredible. And so then
so they were caching it in effect?
Yeah. They were caching it, but they didn't leave. They were sleeping like right next to it. So they had a couple of bare beds right next to it. And then they also had a big pile where they had dug earth and logs and covered up the calf, in between feeding bouts. Yeah. And when we got there, the little bits of remains, they weren't covered anymore. So that was another signal that they probably weren't coming back to feed on it. Right. So then we decided, well, here's where, 2 grizzlies were. Let's do some trailing. Let's practice grizzly trailing, and we figured out where the bears had left. And following the bear trail can be, there's times when it's walking through like really high, fresh plant growth that you can see the trail for 100 yards. It's super obvious. And then times where it's really subtle and you're looking for little scuffs. And this trail was a mixture of difficult and easy. There was some plant growth that was flagging to help keep us on. Sometimes there was soft enough dirt to leave tracks, but there was also long stretches of very hard, just cedar, forest with no plant growth where we couldn't see any trail, and we'd have to, predict the route and try to pick up a track farther ahead. So as we're following these 2 grizzlies from that feeding site, we came out into a big clearing, And on the other side of the clearing was a really dense, dark cedar forest. And the wind from that cedar forest was blowing towards us, right? Inside the cedar forest, too far away to see us, there was a deer snorting. And we talked about whether or not that deer was snorting at the grizzlies, you know? And we had two options, either to keep following the grizzlies trail or to try to sneak around over to where that deer was snorting and see if the bears were there, you know? And in hindsight, I wish that we had tried to sneak over there where that deer was, but I wanted us to, you know, stay with the trail, you know, because that's kind of the physical sign, right? And so we stayed with the trail, and we ended up following them maybe another kilometer to where they had bedded down for the night. And then from those beds, the grizzlies took us right over to where that deer had been snorting.
Wow.
And then the trail walked off and eventually vanished into some place that we couldn't follow. But we're pretty sure that deer was snorting at the grizzlies, leaving those beds that morning, you know?
Yeah, because it was fresh sign, right? And so
super fresh. Yeah. So it's pretty cool.
What a great story. And that perfectly encompasses what you were saying earlier about, you know, how you can learn all these things about behavior and how they were feeding and then what they did afterwards and how other animals react, and obviously some bird language in there, you know, you're talking about. Yeah, that's incredible.
It was cool. It was pretty special. Yeah, it was pretty neat.
Wow. Well, hey, in our remaining time here, just want to ask you again, someone's listening to this, they're interested, but let's say they haven't had time to, you know, learn on their own, or, you know, just a little bit. Can you talk about what people will learn and just the usefulness, and either just, let's say, taking a workshop that, you know, someone like yourself's doing, or even a cyber track or eval, let's say they haven't done one before. What can they expect, and, you know, what kind of experience is that?
Yeah. So I'd say that there's a difference between the evaluations and a workshop, and the evaluation and certification process. It is a field test, you know, so there is an element to being tested there. And the cyber tracker process is broken into two modules: the track and sign ID and the trailing. The track and sign evaluation process can feel more like a workshop. You can show up to one of those without knowing very much. And if you're totally unattached to the score that you get, you're going to learn a ton of stuff. Just because of the way the process is, the evaluators ask a question, everybody gives their answer. And then if there's disagreement about what it is, they go over the field marks. This is how you identify it as a canine instead of a feline. This is how you differentiate it as a wild canine instead of a domestic one. And this is why it's a red fox and not a coyote, right? So all those field marks are pointed out to you. And so the identification evaluation, you will learn a ton. The trailing evaluation is a little different because you're really put on the spot to perform. And it's an opportunity for you to perform and to show us what you can do. And so the feedback we give it at the end to everybody, as opposed to in the moment when it's happening. And so it's a little less like a workshop as far as what you think you're getting out of it. But what's really cool about the trailing evaluations is that you get to watch the other people track. And so you get to see other people in front on the trail and what they're doing and what they're doing right, and where, you know, what they might not be doing right. And you'll get to see the evaluators look for the trail, because everybody loses the trail. And at some point the evaluators are probably going to have to find it. And so you get to see them look for the trail. And you get taken along an animal's trail in a way that will show you how to trail effectively. And so you do learn from the trailing evaluations, but it's not as quite as clear of a workshop as the identification ones are. And I would suggest, if you haven't ever done any trailing, to do a workshop before you take an eval. Not necessary, but you know, it will help.
For sure. And so the evaluations have to be done with a certified evaluator, right? Any cyber tracker evaluator has to get a specialist and then trained to become an evaluator. So we've all been through that process. But anyone that's certified as a level 4 or professional tracker, a specialist or a senior tracker are all people that I would encourage someone to take a workshop from, because they've all scored 100% on an evaluation and they're very skilled at what they do. And so anyone, if you go to the Tracker Certification North America website, it has everybody listed and what their certification level is. And if anyone that is a level 4 professional, senior, or specialist offers workshops, I would say, call them up and see if they can come to your area to do it. And what you'll get is from a workshop really is a breakdown of the process for trailing, how to identify a trail as fresh, how to identify hard substrate, how to look for routes of travel, how to find the trail when you've lost it, talking about animal behavior, how to navigate through the woods, things like this, right? How to move quietly. If you're looking to identify and interpret animal sign, you're going to talk about, what are the different species behaviors and how does that manifest in the environment? How does it look like when they scent mark, things like that, how to differentiate, all the different mustelid weasel tracks, things like that. So you'll get a breakdown of all these different things, and you get to spend time with someone who has devoted a lot of their energy towards an intimate relationship with the natural world and how these animals live and die in it, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, I can personally attest they are great learning experiences, both of them. It's incredible, and like you said, in very different ways, but it's amazing all the things that are covered in there. And before I started this years ago, I really had no idea that it would be that comprehensive. So if you're interested, definitely you can go to Cyber Tracker and check out their calendar, or like Preston was saying, find people in your area, who are qualified, because it's well worth it. Hey, Preston, tell us just a little bit about your book, Tracking the American Black Bear, and what's in it and, what you cover.
Yeah. So I wrote that book to describe the trailing and how to find animals, right? And try to describe the process of how to learn how to effectively trail and catch up and sneak up to animals, which for me was, a lot of that was guided through the Cyber Tracker process, right? And I use black bears kind of as a subject matter for discussing how to do that. But it's not just about bears. You can take the lessons, and descriptions of techniques from that book and apply it to any animal that is leaving a trail that you can follow. It's really a recipe for how to trail and catch up and find animals. And that's what I was just trying to do, was just show what is possible, show what maybe is not possible, and talk about, the successes and struggles that I've had over the years trying to learn this skill. And then kind of illuminate some cool features of black bear natural history that is out there. Some of it is out there in scientific articles that might be hard for some people to read. Some of it is not out there. Some kind of neat things that I figured out. And then I also, part of it is about hunting and my approach to hunting and my thoughts on hunting. For me, hunting is this ancient human, skill set that probably made us who we are, and certainly is something we relied on to live for a very long time. So it's part of us, and it's definitely controversial, in the modern times. And I just wanted to show a potentially other side to it, that maybe was more thoughtful than the most hunting people portray themselves, as well as compassionate. I care about these animals. It's not easy to kill them, but I do eat them and sustain my life on them. And it also kind of has developed a a pretty deep relationship with them, relying on them in that way. So I wanted to, show that side of it too, for better or for worse, I kind of wrote the book.
Thank you very much for that. And again, that website is trackerlongbows.com. And it's an awesome book. It's very well written. And yeah, I really enjoyed it. And thanks again. It's been a great time. Hope we can have you again sometime.